It's a sweltering summer evening in 1771. Deep in the hills of Virginia, a massive 16-year-old farm boy standing shaking in a clearing, his knuckles split and bleeding. At his feet lies a neighbor named William Leachman, unconscious, blood flowing from his mouth, completely limp. The two teenagers just engaged into a brutal, knuckle-splitting brawl over the affections of a local girl. The large boy, panicked by his own terrifying strength, drops to his knees. He grabs Leachman's shoulders, shaking him. No breath, no movement. The 16-year-old stands up, his heart hammering against his ribs. In colonial Virginia, the penalty for murder is the gallows. Convinced that he's just taken a man's life and left a corpse in the dirt, the boy turns his back on his family farm, runs blindly into the dense, black woods, and keeps running. He doesn't pack a bag. He doesn't say goodbye to his mother. He sheds his identity entirely. To make sure the law can never track him, he changes his name to Simon Butler and flees across the rugged Allegheny Mountains into the trackless, bloody wilderness of the Ohio Valley. His real name was Simon Kenton. For the next 11 years, he would live under a dead man's shadow, wandering the western frontier as a ghost. But the boy who fled Virginia looking to escape the hangman's noose was about to stumble directly into a brutal, unyielding wilderness war. Long before the map makers arrived, he would become a towering legend, the ultimate long hunter, a master scout, and the man who would save Daniel Boone from the grave. Today we look at the raw, unpolished epic of Simon Kenton, the giant the frontier couldn't break.
Welcome to Uncommon History, the podcast that uncovers the overlooked, untold, and often surprising stories that shaped our world. Each episode, we dig beneath the surface of familiar events to reveal the strange, the inspiring, and the forgotten threads of history.
Hello and welcome back to Uncommon History. I'm your host, Brian. And if you're tracking with us through this mini-series, we're pulling back the polished textbook myths to expose the true grit of the unsung heroes of the wilderness. We build our narrative straight from the original historical biographies and first-hand colonial journals. Today, we're diving deep into the shadow war of Simon Kenton. If you ask the average person to name an early American frontiersman, they would almost always say Daniel Boone. But if you went back to the late 1700s and asked the actual pioneers who lived inside the fortified blockhouses of Kentucky who they relied upon to keep them alive, they would look at you and name Simon Kenton. Standing a massive 6 feet 4 inches tall, with piercing blue eyes and a shock of auburn hair, Kenton was a physical marvel of the frontier. But unlike Boone, Kenton didn't have a formal education. He was completely illiterate. He never learned to read or write, only knowing how to scratch his own name onto a piece of parchment. His school was the deep woods. His letters were the bent twigs, the crushed leaves, and the rising smoke of Ohio country. To survive the landscape where a single misstep meant a swift ambush, Kenton had to develop a supernatural understanding of the wilderness warfare. He lived as a phantom, surviving trials that would have killed the ordinary man 10 times over. Let's step back to the road of trials, where a teenage runaway had to reinvent himself from scratch in a hostile world. When 16-year-old Simon Kenton crossed the mountains into Fort Pitt, modern-day Pittsburgh, he was a young man without a home, a past, or an identity. Adopting the alias Simon Butler, he cast his lot with the rough, nomadic long hunters who ventured deep into the Ohio Valley to trap beaver and hunt deer. This was a brutal, unforgiving apprenticeship. The Ohio country wasn't an empty paradise. It was an ancestral hunting grounds of the Shawnee, Delaware, and the Wyandot nations, fiercely prepared to defend their territory from colonial encroachment. The young runaway quickly learned that on the frontier, complacency is a death sentence. During the freezing winter of 1773, an 18-year-old Kenton was camped along the Kanawha River in present-day West Virginia with 2 hunting companions. They had spent a long, exhausting day wading through freezing streams and checking traps. As night fell, a torrential downpour soaked their buckskin, and they built a large, roaring fire to dry their gear and warm their shivering bodies. It was a catastrophic tactical mistake. The bright flames cut through the black forest like a beacon. Without warning, the dark woods erupted with musket fire. A volley of lead tore through the camp. One of Kenton's companions was instantly struck through the heart, dropping dead into the embers of the fire. Kenton and the surviving partner didn't even have time to grab their rifles, their heavy winter coats, or their food pouches. They leaped blindly out of the firelight into the pitch-black freezing darkness, scrambling down a muddy ravine while bullets ripped through the branches above their heads. They survived the initial ambush, but they found themselves stranded in the dead of winter with absolutely nothing. No shoes, no weapons, no blankets, and no food. For 6 grueling days, the two men trudged through the frozen wilderness toward the nearest settlement, miles away. Their feet became severely frostbitten. Their skin was torn to ribbons by briars, and they were forced to chew on raw tree bark and roots just to keep their stomachs from collapsing. By the time they staggered into a frontier camp, Kenton was emaciated. His massive frame was reduced to skin and bone. Most teenage boys would have taken that horrific near-death experience as a sign to return east to civilization. But the ordeal did something completely different to Kenton. It hardened him. It cured him of his youthful innocence. He realized that to survive on this frontier, he could never be the prey again. He had to become the premier scout. Kenton spent the next year obsessively studying the tactics of his adversaries. He learned how to walk without snapping a single dry twig, how to reload a flintlock long rifle while running at full speed through thick brush, and how to spot camouflage warriors hidden in a patch of tall cane grass. He developed an uncanny internal compass, navigating hundreds of miles trackless forest without ever looking at a map. By 1774, his reputation as an elite woodsman caught the attention of the colonial military authorities. When Lord Dunmore's War erupted between the colony of Virginia and the Shawnee Confederacy, 19-year-old Simon Kenton was officially hired as a primary frontier scout. He wasn't fighting in rigid formations. He was operating in the deep shadows, running miles ahead of the main army to locate enemy movements and to prevent deadly ambushes. It was during this campaign that he first crossed paths with other legendary figures of the era, men like George Rogers Clark and Simon Girty. But his true destiny was waiting for him further south, across the Ohio River, in a dark, beautiful, and bloody territory known as Kentucky. By 1775, Kenton had migrated into the interior of Kentucky, tracking reports of vast, mythic cane lands, stretches of giant, tall cane grass that indicated incredibly rich, fertile soil. Along with his companion, he cleared a small patch of land near modern-day Maysville, planting what many historians believe was the very first plot of corn cultivated by colonial settlers north of the Kentucky River. But Kenton couldn't stay a simple farmer. The American Revolution had broken out back east, and the British agents in Detroit were actively arming and supplying Ohio tribes with weapons, encouraging them to launch devastating raids to entirely wipe out the infant American settlements in Kentucky. Kenton moved his operations to Boonesboro, the fortified station founded by Daniel Boone. The small fort was in a state of constant siege, surrounded by a vast forest where enemy war parties watched the gates day and night. Kenton became the fort's primary life support line. While other settlers huddled in terror inside the wooden stockade, Kenton would slip out the gates under the cover of pitch darkness, venturing out alone into the woods and hunt buffalo and deer to feed the starving families and to scout for signs of incoming war parties. On April 24, 1777, the ultimate test of his character arrived. Early that morning, a small group of Shawnee warriors launched a decoy attack just outside the gates of Boonesboro. Firing on the handful of laborers working in the clearings, Daniel Boone, a veteran commander, gathered a party of 10 armed men and rushed out of the fort to drive the attackers back in the woods. Simon Kenton, carrying his loaded long rifle, followed closely behind Boone's party. As Boone's men pushed into the brush, Kenton's razor-sharp eyes scanned the tree line. He noticed a subtle shifting in the tall grass along their flanks. Instantly, his blood ran cold. It was a classic frontier trap. A force of over 100 Shawnees warriors rose up from the brush, cutting directly across the clearing to position themselves between Boone's party and the safety of the fort gates. The air erupted with deafening roar of musket fire. Boone's men were completely surrounded, heavily outmanned, and catching lead from all sides. In the opening salvo, a musket ball shattered Daniel Boone's leg, snapping the bone and sending the legendary pioneer tumbling into the dirt. Entirely helpless, a large Shawnee warrior leaped from the brush, hatchet raised high, rushing directly toward the fallen Boone to deliver a lethal blow. Boone closed his eyes, expecting the end, but Simon Kenton was already moving. With supernatural speed, the 6'4" scout leveled his heavy rifle, took a split-second aim through the thick smoke, and pulled the trigger. The musket ball struck the charging warrior squarely in the chest, dropping him instantly feet away from Boone. Kenton didn't even take time to reload his empty weapon. Dropping his rifle to the dirt, he charged directly into the melee, using his massive physical frame to plow through the oncoming attackers. He reached Boone, scooped the older frontiersman up into massive arms like a child, and slung him over his broad shoulders. With bullets whizzing past his ears and hatchets cutting the air around him, Kenton sprinted across the blood-soaked clearing, fighting his way through the enemy line, and carried Boone safely through the heavy wooden gates of Boonesboro just before they slammed shut. That evening, as a doctor set Boone's shattered leg inside the fort, the normally reserved Daniel Boone called Kenton over to his bedside. Boone looked up at the 22-year-old runaway and said, "Well, Simon, you have behaved yourself like a man today. Indeed, you are a fine fellow." Coming from the most famous frontiersman alive, it was the ultimate validation. But Kenton's road to trials was about to take an even darker and more terrifying turn. In the fall of 1778, Kenton crossed the Ohio River on a high-stakes spying mission to locate a major Shawnee named Chillicothe. While attempting to secure a number of horses from the village, his luck finally ran out. He was captured by a large force of Shawnee warriors. For most white settlers, captured by the Shawnee during the height of the Revolution meant swift execution and prolonged torture. But when the warriors realized they had captured the legendary Simon Butler, the giant scout who had killed so many of their brethren, they decided his punishment had to be legendary. They stripped him naked, bound his hands tightly behind his back, and forced him to run the infamous quarter-mile frontier gauntlet. The gauntlet consisted of 2 long lines, over 100 warriors, women, and children standing face to face, armed with heavy hickory clubs, thick sticks, sharp rocks. The prisoner was forced to sprint down the center of the gauntlet while both lines beat him with unyielding fury. Most prisoners were beaten to death and knocked unconscious with the first 100 yards. Kenton took a deep breath, clenched his jaw, and sprinted into the corridor of pain. Using his massive size and sheer momentum, he dodged and wove through the blows, taking shattering hits to his shoulders, arms, and back. He survived the first run. Furious and astonished by his resilience, the tribe forced him to run it again and again. Over the course of his brutal captivity, Simon Kenton was forced to run the gauntlet an unbelievable 9 separate times. His skin was blackened with deep bruises, his bones were fractured, and his body was pushed to the absolute brink of human endurance. They tied him to a stake, preparing to burn him alive, and even painted his face black, the traditional tribal mark of a condemned man. They gave him a new name, Kut-ta-ha-ta, meaning condemned man. Yet, through the sheer physical stamina and an unyielding will to live, Kenton refused to die. During this torment, he was unexpectedly recognized by Simon Girty, his old scouting companion from Dunmore's War, who had since defected to the British Indian Alliance. Girty, remembering their old bond in the woods, used his immense diplomatic influence with the chief to temporarily spare Kenton's life, convincing them to adopt the giant warrior instead of burning him. Eventually, Kenton was moved to the British stronghold at Fort Detroit as a high-value prisoner of war. But you cannot hold a ghost in a cage. By 1779, Kenton managed to slip past the guards, escape into the deep northern woods, and navigate hundreds of miles of hostile territory to return to his post under George Rogers Clark. He had walked directly through the Valley of Death and emerged unbroken. By 1782, the landscape of American frontier was beginning to shift. The Revolutionary War was winding down, and a steady stream of incoming settlers were pouring into towns like Kenton spent decades defending. But Kenton was still living under his self-imposed exile, believing he was a wanted murderer named Simon Butler. Then, a traveler arriving from Virginia brought a stunning piece of news that shattered Kenton's entire reality. William Leachman, the teenager Kenton thought he had killed in the old muddy clearing 11 years earlier, hadn't died at all. He had simply been knocked unconscious, woke up a few hours later with a severe headache, and had gone on to live a long, prosperous life in Virginia. For over a decade, Kenton had lived as a fugitive in the wilderness, running from a ghost. The psychological weight instantly evaporated. The runaway boy was finally free to reclaim his true birthright. He formally shed the alias Simon Butler and took back his real family name, Simon Kenton. He even traveled back to Virginia to visit his old home, introducing his aging mother to the legendary frontier scout her son had become. Kenton returned to Kentucky as a celebrated hero. He built his own fortified settlement, Kenton Station in Mason County, welcoming thousands of new pioneers into the territory. He married, started a family, and amassed an empire of land claims across Kentucky and Ohio, totaling hundreds of thousands of acres. But while Kenton was a master of wilderness strategy, he was completely defenseless against the complex legal maneuvering of civilization. Because he was completely illiterate and couldn't read the dense legal contracts, slick land speculations, and smooth-talking lawyers systematically exploiting his technical paperwork errors. One by one, his massive land titles were successfully challenged in court. The man who had scouted, bled for, and defended the very soul of Kentucky was technically stripped of every single acre he owned. By 1820, an elderly Simon Kenton was actually thrown into debtor's prison in Washington, Kentucky, incarcerated by the very legal system of the state he helped build. The public was rightfully outraged. The local jailer, a man named Thomas Williams, who had been one of Kenton's earliest frontier companions, refused to lock Kenton in a cell, allowing him to wander the town on his word of honor alone. Eventually, the state legislature revoked the archaic debtor's law, releasing the old scout from the legal bonds. Kenton spent his final years living in a modest cabin in Ohio, often in relative poverty, but held in immense universal respect by everyone who understood the true history of the West. When the War of 1812 erupted, an aging Kenton answered the call one last time, achieving the ranks of brigadier general in the state militia and serving as a key scout at the historic Battle of the Thames, the definitive engagement where the greatest Shawnee leader, Tecumseh, was killed. According to the frontier accounts after the battle, eager American soldiers wanted to mutilate Tecumseh's body for cheap battlefield trophies. Kenton, who had spent his entire life fighting the Shawnee but held a profound, sacred respect for his adversaries, purposefully misidentified a different fallen warrior as Tecumseh, protecting the great chief's true remains from desecration. He was a warrior who understood that true strength requires an equal measure of honor. When we look back at the cinematic life of Simon Kenton, we see a man who spent 11 years running from a crime he didn't even commit. He allowed profound mistakes to push him into the wilderness crucible that ultimately forged him into the protector of thousands of lives. He didn't let the lack of a formal education or his illiteracy define his capacity for leadership. He mastered the environment he was given, running the gauntlet of life with an iron spine and a quiet demeanor. Kenton reminds us that your past failures and your deepest fears are often just the fuel used to drive you into places where your true strength is required. You might feel like a ghost wandering your own wilderness today, but if you keep moving forward with honor, patience, and absolute resilience, you'll find your true path out of the shadows and onto the frontier of your own life. Stay disciplined, stay resilient, and never let the gauntlet break your spirit. If Kenton's story of survival and honor resonated with you today, please take a quick moment to support our show. Subscribe or follow the podcast on the platform of your choice so you never miss an episode. Leave a review or a comment. Let me know your thoughts. Did you know Kenton saved Daniel Boone's life? Share this episode with a history buff or a friend who values the raw, unvarnished truth of the past. And we'll see you next time on Uncommon History.